Welcome to Surfacing. In this episode, hosts Lisa Welchman and Andy Vitale speak to information architect and educator Jorge Arango. This episode saw a discussion of digital ethics and roles that designers, business leaders, policymakers, and ethicists play in keeping digital spaces safe. Jorge considers the responsibility associated with architecting online experiences and offers insight into the dynamics that come with the long arc of technological innovation.
Hello.
How are you, Jorge?
I'm doing all right, but I can't quite hit those notes.
I was expecting a singing
Lisa.
response.
I'm getting over a cold, and my singing voice, what little there is of it, is not here today.
Are you a singer?
No, I'm not. I'm a bad karaoke singer.
Yeah, but do you enjoy singing? Not do you sing professionally, how good are you? But do you, like, some people sing and some people don't.
I have a really kind of pernicious combination of enjoying singing and having no shame. So.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's a rare combination.
That no shame part, like, yeah. I like to sing and have been trained as a singer and have sung sort of professionally when I was super young and whatever, but I never had this brazen shamelessness that comes along with it, which I really envy people. When I see that, it looks so joyous to just really not care and be like, I'm doing this because I love it, right?
Well, I'm not going to say that I don't care. It takes practice. I think it's hard to not try to take yourself too seriously, but I think it's important, right?
Yeah, I'm still learning that at my old age. So thanks for that wonderful reminder. And thank you for giving us some of your time today. We really, really appreciate it. When Andy and I decided to do the podcast, we say this a lot, so it might sound disingenuous, but it is true in your instance and true every time we've said it. Like, we had a list of people who we would want to interview, and you were on like the first wave list. So we're finally getting a chance to talk to you in particular. So before I start asking questions, because I think I get to the first question today, why don't you just tell people a little bit about yourself? How do you like to describe yourself? We were all over your blog posts, and we were just saying, he does everything. He thinks about everything. So we're going to let you frame who you are, other than a reckless, abandoned karaoke singer.
It's funny. I think that there is a relationship there because I think about everything in much the same way I sing at karaoke, which is to say, without too much self-awareness and very kind of unself-consciously. I do like to roam as widely as possible. But to answer your question, I am an information architect. I have been doing this type of work now for a long time. If I say how long, I might reveal my age, which is not something that is well regarded these days, apparently.
That's a part where I don't care. I'm like, I'm 57 and I'm owning all of it every single year.
All right, I'll say it. I've been doing this for over a quarter of a century. Gosh, I feel old. And that means that I am one of the people who got into what we now call user experience design fairly early on. I was drawn to the field by the appearance of the first web browser. And I come from a background in architecture, and I left my career in architecture when the web came out. I had this moment of insight, I guess you could call it, where I realized that this was something that had No, I was going to say, I realized that it had the potential to change the world. I think it was more than that. Like, it was blindingly obvious that this was something that was going to radically transform how we live. And I wanted to work in this space. And I also had this insight that somehow my training as an architect would be useful. And that has proven to be the case. So I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to have this career in making information easier to find and understand. And that's how I understand information architecture. That's what we do.
So thanks for that. And I'm going to take this first question. The reason why we've wanted to talk to you is, Andy and I, the reason why we even have this podcast is we're going to write a book about digital safety. The working title was Designing for Safety. And we thought that the combination of, sort of my skills as a governance person and Andy's skills as a designer and as a design leader would be two good inputs for thinking about safety. And quickly, the way that my head went when thinking about safety was, well, what else do we care about the safety of, right? So what do we already know? Let's not invent this from scratch. And so I very quickly landed on looking at, particularly in the US, because that's where I am at the time, consumer product safety, like the baby stroller, the car, the fact that if you're in California and now almost anywhere, you have to screw your tall furniture to the wall so it doesn't fall over during, an earthquake, things like that. And so that understanding of making corollaries between the physical world and the digital world on the product level seemed very similar to the corollaries and some of the things that you were talking about, your book, Living in Information, which, by the way, is one of my favorite books, right? Is I really enjoy talking about that and this idea of places, right? And thinking about designing for places, human spaces, that people inhabit online versus transactions, services, little tactical sort of things that we have happen. And so, yes, you've written an entire book about this, but it's been a bit since you've written the book. We've gone around the block even harder than I think, you alluded to in that book. We'd already done the 2016 election in the US and seen that, but it's just gotten even more, all the more interesting even globally. I think today, the day we're taping this, we found out that I could be wrong about my facts, but I think Nigeria is like shutting down Twitter or something today because they don't like what's going on. And so that's a very long wind up to ask you a question of, what are your thoughts on that right now, particularly as social media as a public sphere, right? Social media is that place where people gather and talk to each other. What is your sort of updated thought on that since you've written the book? I'm sure you have many thoughts.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that prompt. You mentioned consumer products as things that we regulate for safety. Architecture is one of the things we regulate for safety, right? Yep. It's actually one of the oldest, I don't know if it's the oldest regulated design discipline, in that the Code of Hammurabi speaks of penalties for architects whose houses collapse, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
So it's pretty old. And the interesting thing with the internet and digital things is that they are in many ways a new type of thing in the world. And in some ways, you see our language kind of grappling to try to describe what these things are. And we talk about analogies, metaphors. We think of a lot of the things that we're making as products or as tools. Even in my book, we think about them as places, right? But in many ways, they're none of those things. They're a new type of thing that we don't have really good language for yet. And all this stuff is evolving. Which is to say that we must acknowledge that as a species, we don't have much experience dealing with these things. And whenever a new thing like this appears in the world, which is not often, by the way, I don't think that there are many things as different as the internet and the web that we've invented in a long time. Whenever new things come into the world, it takes a while for us to come to grips with what is the best way for us to make use of these things without causing harm. And the fact, it's an interesting fact that this is happening at a time when everything seems to be speeding up. So as we record this, I think that product cycles are getting shorter in some ways. And the thing that comes to mind is this app Clubhouse, which just feels like just a few months ago was a really hot thing, right? And now I barely hear of Clubhouse, right?
Right.
It's like this thing kind of emerged. It looked like it was about to take off and take over the world. And everyone was using it. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, people barely talk about this anymore. And it seems like everything is speeding up, right? Like these cycles are speeding up. And I think that one of the things that happens in our sped up culture is that we develop expectations for how long things should take. And I think that we have expectations that that somehow these processes of acculturation of something like a radical new technology would operate at the same speed that we expect other things to operate on. And I just don't think that that we have good evidence for that. I think that it's going to take time. It's going to take time for us to figure out how to do these things. And my concern, I don't know that it's an easy thing to start promulgating specific, let's use the word regulations, which is what at least went to my mind when you were talking about this. I think it might be early days for this, in that in some ways regulation is in tension with the pace of development of the technologies themselves. And the internet and digital technologies more generally are still changing quickly enough where the processes that we have in place to regulate them might take longer than it takes for new technologies to appear that somehow skirt those regulations or render them moot, right? And the example that I use for this is our current interactions with things like social networks, or even what we're doing now, right? Talking through Zoom, are happening mediated through an interface that, even though it's relatively new in the big scheme of things, still has been around for a while. Namely, I'm looking at a computer screen. I have a keyboard and trackpad in front of me. I'm wearing a headset and have a microphone in front of me. And these things, we've known how to interact with these things for a while. But there are new technologies coming. Well, I wouldn't say they're coming to market just now, but they're at least in the labs for doing things like direct neural connections to your brain and stuff like that, which that renders a lot of the interface that we're using right now. I would imagine that it renders much of it obsolete. And I wonder, when we talk about these things, like, are we trying to specify guidelines or regulations for a moving target somehow? So I don't think that it's an easy thing to solve, and I think that it forces us to kind of go back to first principles. And I'd be very curious actually to hear from you all about safety and what does safety mean in this context, because we could have a conversation, right, about what first principles are in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on to that, I mean, that's a really rich answer for me, because you're touching on, my area of expertise, which is governance, right? When you start talking about policy and regulation, and I don't disagree with you. I have a similar talk. We can compare notes on this, maybe even now, about just the life cycle of technology adoption. And so I agree that there are the pathway towards any new technology coming into the human system is similar. It happens, somebody invents it, or it's discovered, however you want to describe that event. People do crazy stuff with it to figure out what to do with it, right? It causes a lot of harm. Folks get up in arms. We decide that we need to do something about it. And then we messily get from that point to some set of regulations or constraints around or an agreement about what we do and do not do with that technology. And that path can take 80 to 100 years. Right. So that is kind of like my perspective on that. So I don't disagree with you. But one area I'd just like to push on a little teeny tiny bit when you said it's early days. I don't think it's early days to consider the framework of governing those spaces and to begin to articulate and understand the harm. Right. So, I always use this reference all the time, early automobiles. A lot of the safety features that weren't mandatory until the 1970s, 80s, and later, and still not in some countries, were invented early on in the product life cycle. They were invented in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So, we had 3-point seatbelts, we had safety glass, we had a lot of different things. And then we just had to have the will or the reason or the rationale to decide to regulate around that. And so I just wanted to add that, yes, I agree with you. It's early days, but it's not too early to start considering the nature of the harm.
Absolutely, right? And you've articulated it much better. But that's what I meant by first principles, right?
Okay, cool.
Trying to think through. The thing that concerns me is that we might be tempted to lay down, let's call them rules that are much too granular or much too tied to the interfaces we know now, right? And that I think would be a mistake. But definitely, we need to think about what we're doing kind of on a first principles basis. So, for example, what kind of, without thinking about specific UIs, right? Like what kind of interactions should these things accommodate? Right, and what something that is a particular interest of mine. It's like what business models make sense for which types of use cases, because they're not all the same, right?
Nope.
The business model that powers a search engine, so let me back up there. So right now we have a situation where search engines and places where we catch up with our friends and family, let's call them that, right? Both of those are using the same business model. And I don't think that those are the same types of things, right? And I don't know that the same business model is equally applicable to both without leading to some harm, let's call it, right? Or to negative effects.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, because even in our definition of safety, we talk about how you can only minimize that, right? You can't completely eliminate it. But with these business models that are being generated, and maybe it's speed to market or not thinking things through that are really helping piggyback business models off of other what feels similar at the time business models. The thing that you touched upon that I really want to dive into a little bit more, I'm thinking here, is time. So you were talking about it might make sense to regulate things in terms of principles rather so much than being really granular in the process. And I think that one of the things that I struggle with, or I see a lot of designers struggle with, and Lisa will debate me on this all day, is those regulations that are set and then they become too old and they still don't change. So in thinking about what to regulate, when and why, and how to adapt those, how are the business models that you're describing kind of fall into place in that situation? And then beyond that, how granular or how non-granular should we get to regulate things like principles in the beginning?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this sort of thing, but I'll tell you that my sense is that, well, first of all, I think I agree with you, Andy, in that we cannot overly specify things. Like I said, especially in a field like this, which is changing so quickly. And I actually don't even know if I advocate for regulations per se of things like these fundamentals we're talking about, because I don't know how that can be done. I think that what I would prefer, the type of approach that I would prefer is almost like a cultural approach, where what we do is we help clarify and articulate a set of values that becomes widely adopted by the culture. And those values are what give then rise to things like regulations. I think it was Drucker that said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And we need to be clear on what our values are. And that's what I meant by first principles, right? And that's a conversation that I don't see happening as much. I see a lot of conversation about regulation, which is why I brought up the word, right? It's like, let's break up big tech or whatever, or let's regulate what they can or cannot do. And there are all sorts of conversations happening about this, both on the left and the right, right? I think that Florida just recently passed a law that constrains what social media companies can do to politicians' accounts, right? So it's I think that there's a recognition in society that these online experiences, or I'll use the term in the book, these information environments, these places where we're having these conversations, have an important civic role, and they're becoming something of a political football, right? In that folks with different persuasions will want to regulate them, to benefit their worldview. And the conversation that I don't see happening is one where we talk as a society about what values we would like to make manifest in these things. And I think that they're not values that are necessarily tied to digital experiences. They're wider than that, right? Like what we're doing is we are in the process of moving so many of our long-standing human interactions to these things. We're shopping, we're learning, we're working, right? Especially during the pandemic. There's people meeting their mates online. All of those things these are things that human beings have done for a long time. What's different is that we're doing them in this weird new environment that we don't fully understand yet. And I think that we have to be very mindful with how we approach the guardrails that we put in place. That's how I would characterize it.
Yeah, so I'm realizing as I'm listening to you talk that we have just an incredible opportunity to have a conversation with someone who actually would like to have this particular discussion I'm interested in, which is, everyone wants our online world to be better than it is. Very few people are content with it, whatever your political persuasion is and wherever you are geographically. Sometimes it's fundamental. When we're talking about online, it might be something like access to the internet. People want faster, more consistent access to the internet, or even access to it in the first place, all the way to this sort of extravagance of me with like this really high-speed stuff going on. But there are features that I want, right? So, and also within the sort of maker and community of people that contribute to the making and design of online experiences, all of those contributing factors. And one of the things that Andy and I talk about a lot is, whose job is it to make sure that we start to address these sort of cultural aspects as you describe them, which then do get translated into actual business objectives and goals and experiences and family experiences and things and places. It contributes to the establishment of these places online. So I have written down some players that I think are in this field. And of course, the answer is all of them, right? I mean, we can just probably cut to the chase and say it's not like there's one sole role that's responsible for getting this done. But we've got business. So these businesses and their business models, that's one set of people. Then we have sort of academia, this more academic, esoteric bent of ethicists, right? People who may or may not have experience making things online, but are used to looking at, things through an ethical lens and looking at that arc, and often have it in a historical context, right? Then we've got the design community. From the very tactical pedal to the metal, and I mean design in the broadest sense, right? So anybody that is contributing to the making of these online places. And then we've got, in this fourth pod, I'm going to call it policy, but I'm putting into that regulatory compliance, these state rate things, people who are trying to make laws and overarching broad geographic rules or vertical market rules that will actually control what gets done and doesn't get done. So one, who am I missing in that pod of sort of players? And then two, what do we do? So one of the things that I've participated in softly as a lurker is the University of Amsterdam has developed a platform for ethics and politics of technology, right? And it's led by academics, and they've drawn in, it's multidisciplinary, but it's multidisciplinary within the academic community, right? And one of my first criticisms, and I sort of got a non-answer from them, was, where's the business school? Right? They had it was all like philosophers and I think maybe they had some legal people in there, but nobody from the business school. And I was like, they're usually causing a lot of the problem. So, or contributing to it a lot. So these things are starting to happen. And so, that's me talking a lot and broadly of just like, what do you see in that space? Like how might that, and I know you probably don't know the answer, but how might that be engineered? How might we collaborate to have a more unified, comprehensive discussion about making these places safer?
Yeah, I love that question, and I do have an answer for you, but I want to circle back to something you said earlier, which is that you said that people want access to the internet, and when you said that, I think that you said that people want like faster connections or whatever. Where my mind went when I heard you say that was the jobs to be done framework, right? Like the Clay Christensen thing, where I wonder if people want access to the internet, or if what they really want is to be able to, shop on Amazon, or to pay their taxes, or to file an unemployment claim, or look for a job, right? It's like the things that people use the internet for. So I don't think that people go on the internet for the sake of going on the internet. I think that they go on the internet for all these things that they can do online, right? Which is increasingly, like we said earlier, it's increasingly encroaching upon more and more of the things that we do in physical environments. The software is eating the world thing. So and the reason I mentioned that prior to actually tackling your question is that, to me, the answer to that is the change should be led by the institutions that provide that type of value to people, right? So you mentioned business, you mentioned academia. That
made you laugh.
Well, it made me pause because I don't think that they provide the same type of value, right? I think that...
but they think they do.
Well, I must tread carefully here because I am in academia myself. I teach, but I'm well aware of the fact that the work that I do with businesses has a different type of impact on society than the work that I do teaching students. And it's not that one is more important than the other, because the students that I'm teaching are going to go on to help design the experiences that businesses put out into the world. So there's a huge leverage there, right? But they definitely have different scale. I think that many more people engage directly with the work put out by businesses than they do with the work put out by academia. I believe that to be the case. I might be wrong.
Yeah,
at least here in the United States, And I must make that disclaimer because I have had folks write in from other places saying, it's not like that here. We have a much larger civic sector or a much larger nonprofit sector or what have you, right? But here in the US, business is a huge, huge part of it. I think that civic institutions are a huge part of it. And I think that religious institutions are a big part of it. All of the actors that have informed human societies have a role to play in doing this. And one of my hobby horses is encouraging all of us to think more broadly, not just in terms of our interests, but also in terms of our time perspectives. We are very present biased because of what we were talking about earlier, the speeding up cycles. And that causes us to perhaps not pay as much attention to or not value as much the structures that our work rests upon. Like the things that we're working on did not emerge overnight. They've been built on a scaffolding that has been put into place for good or bad, right? Like some of these things might not be positive, and we might examine the infrastructure and say, hey, this needs changing, and that's happening, right? Like those conversations are happening. But for the most part, I see us being a little short-sighted there. So I think that taking a look at the institutions, the organizations that have informed society, traditionally for a long time, is important. I'll add one more thing. You mentioned the design community, and I think that you said, I wrote down here that the designers, as they contribute to the making of places. I question the degree to which designers are really influencing the shape of the places we make. And I'll circle back to your question earlier about what has changed for me since I wrote the book in my understanding of these things. This is perhaps one of the main things that has changed it in my mind. I wrote that book primarily with designers in mind, thinking designers must know about these things because we are in this position to change things. And today I am less clear on the degree to which designers have real influence here. I think that the design profession has kind of painted itself into a corner by not embracing the full complexity of the systems that we're designing into. And designers, a lot of designers, I'm not going to say all designers because I don't think it's true, but a lot of designers have set up this duality in their minds that that design is somehow about standing up for users in distinction to those evil-doing business people or what have you, right? Like there's this duality that's implicit there. And, I'm in the room to, I stand for the users is the motto, right? And it's not that it's bad to be the user advocate. I think it's central to the work we do. But if you think of yourself somehow as an actor within the system that is here to upend the system as a whole, you're going to have a hard going of it. You're going to have a hard going of having the sort of influence that designers actually aspire to.
Say that in a different way. I'm not sure if I understood that last point. Say that in a different way.
So I see, there's the old cliche about designers wanting a seat at the table.
Yes.
Right? By which they mean, this is my interpretation now, we want to be seen as more than people who make widgets pretty, right? or who make things more accessible or more engaging. We want to actually have a say in the strategic direction that things take. And I think that it's important that designers aspire to that, because design is not just about making things. It's also about helping us determine better new ways of being, right? By prototyping, by trying out new things. And it's a method of making that involves it very practically putting things in the world and seeing how the world responds. So and that's a very different approach to making things than modeling results in a spreadsheet, right? So that's the value that design brings to the table. But if we are perceived by the other people around the table as not being team players somehow, as being there to not support the directions that the organization wants to go towards, then I think it's going to be hard going to get that type of influence. It's a tough problem to solve, because you might look around you and see that the decisions that are being made are contrary to your values, and that might be a very difficult situation for someone to be in. Like I can think of few things more frustrating for someone in their career than to be working in an environment where you feel like you're supporting things that are contrary to your values. And if your values are somehow contrary to the values of the business that you're working for, that's going to manifest, and it's going to come across to the people that you're working with. And you're not going to have the degree of influence that you expect. So not just are you going to be frustrated because there's this misalignment, you're going to be frustrated because you're not going to have real agency, So that's something, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you said a lot of things there, and I don't disagree with any of them. But at the same time, I feel like the spaces that I've seen and how designers have evolved into being part of the strategy in places where they're just seen as beauty falls a lot on design leadership and the people that run the design teams. And it's their job to figure out that momentum and expose that momentum and build upon that and share that and drive influence through like changes that have been made. But, there are instances where design is low maturity in some organizations, and at that point, that team, is definitely at a place where they can build that trust and build that relationship and build that influence by going with the flow rather than what you said, being the ones that feel like they're the ones advocating for the user, going against the business, because that's not set up for success anywhere. And I think that's just low maturity in somebody's career. Right. It's noble to say, hey, I'm going to go work at this company to completely change the way they do things. And the way to actually make change is to do that, is to be in the weeds and help drive the change. But it's about the relationships that you build with people to gain that influence. But just that was just my thought there. The question I have, though, is around like people working in a place where they don't agree with the values of the company. I mean, right now in this market, there are more people than there are jobs available for them, or opposite, right? There's 1 million jobs, but there's 1 million people. So, if I'm someone that's like, you know what, I really hate the automobile industry. Like, I don't even give a shit about it. Like, why would I apply there? It just doesn't make sense. So the thought of, I know that happens, but the thought of people are going to go work somewhere that completely frustrates them. I know it happens, but it's kind of crazy to me. Like, I would never go apply or go to work for a company where I didn't feel that I could provide value, have input, start to like shape things. But again, like you and I both, we're both involved in academia, and we teach students, and a lot of them getting their first job is like, I got to get my foot in the door, and it's so hard. So sometimes they do fall into that space. But I'm just thinking, like, I don't know, why do people do that? Why do people set out to frustrate themselves? And, as we try to, let's look at even like architecture, as we try to architect our own career, what are some of the ways that make that a little bit easier for us, especially earlier on in our careers?
I'll say this, speaking solely from my own experience, because I went through that process as well myself, and it's especially true of architecture students. Well, again, I'll speak for myself, but I left architecture school with an incredibly inflated ego. There's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. I'm not going to describe a comic strip on the radio, as they say, but I might send you the link to post it. But there's this general perception in the culture that architects are very kind of confident of their opinions, let's say, and you kind of have to be if you are going to be making such a radical intervention in the world as a building, right? But I remember leaving architecture school with a very outsized impression of my own knowledge and abilities, and I remember hitting the job market, like being in a job after that, and having to very, very quickly kind of come back to a healthier engagement with the reality of the expectations of the job, the business I was working for, the society where these things were going to be deployed, right? And that the word that I would use for that is humility, right? Like having some kind of humility to recognize that we might be excited and we might have a lot of energy and a lot of learnings and a lot of we might have this impulse to want to change things, but there is a limit to what we know, and especially today. Like I go online every day. And I keep a journal, and one of the things that I write down on my journal every day is like, what did I learn yesterday? And there's so much that it's like every day there's something. It's like, my God, like if there's anything that I'm becoming aware of every year that is growing, is like my awareness of my own ignorance, and the more I discover my ignorance of things, the more I realize that I must be very mindful with the degree to which I express certainty in my opinions. And I think that one of the effects that social media has had on us is that it's given us these incredible megaphones that amplify our voice, and we are so ready to use them to express certainty that I think that for the vast majority of us is unmerited. So I would say that humility is something that we all need to work on a lot more.
I agree. 100%. Like my first design job taught me so much humility. Thankfully for the person that sat me aside and was like, you know what, like you may think you're doing a really good job, but there's so much that you don't know, and I'm going to spend some time to show you. And I think, as a design leader, you can see as the team gains in confidence, the hardest part is to like throw in some opportunities for them to kind of learn, continue to learn, make sure they realize they're not the expert in everything. And those opportunities help them gain humility, but without the thing we don't want to do is conflate egos, but we also don't want to hurt confidence in anyone.
Absolutely. You must do it compassionately, with the compassion that comes from having been there yourself, right? You would not be where you are today if you hadn't had mentors who had helped you understand the limits of your own understanding, right? In a way that didn't alienate you, that didn't turn you away from the work. Because ultimately, this is a discipline. And by the way, I think that word discipline is very important. And it's a craft, right? Like, so there's this, we can talk about in the abstract about these academic principles and all these things, but ultimately there's a craft to design. And the way that, again, going to this idea of like looking at the past, the way that design disciplines were traditionally thought was with this apprenticeship model, where you would, if you were a person who guilds, right, and you were new to the field, and you would work with in the studio of the word that was traditionally used was master, which is a word that we must look beyond because it's problematic, right? But this relationship where you understand your relationship. If you're an apprentice, you understand your relationship to the person that you're apprenticing under, right? And there is this this understanding that what you're looking to do is to develop this craft, to develop this mastery of the thing that you that you do. Right, which and with the sense of mastery comes pride in doing a good job. Right, there's the desire to do the same for others. So the awareness that as you advance in your career, you are responsible for helping the people who are coming into the career, right? Like, and that's something that I know, Andy, you teach as well. And I don't know, Lisa, do you teach?
No, I do an incredible amount of mentoring, though.
There you go. So same thing, right? But I think that the three of us then are aware of this idea that as you progress in your career, you have a responsibility to the next generation to pass on what you have learned, right? And that's, to me, that's I'm not going to call it a natural progression, but it's certainly a progression that has stood the test of time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really listening to you and not disagreeing with anything, but I just think I have to add, as the woman and brownest person on the podcast, that I so much agree with two words you said, which is humility and discipline. But I think it's important to say that some of us culturally are forced into a position of humility, right? And in fact, that I think is the value that women of color in particular bring to the table, women and women of color, people of color, I guess I should say, bring to the table, which is that, there are a lot of extremely highly competent, humble people already, right? Who oftentimes don't get placed in a job or don't get considered because they haven't mastered that loud swagger, or because they're just flat out objectified and not assumed to be in that spot. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, but how that resonates in a person's career, right, is very, very different based on who you are and what you look like. And I'll stress again that the strength in a human being who has spent a large portion of their adult life, and including myself and just others, knowing already that their opinion is not the last word. There's a whole set of people who already occupy that space, who don't have to learn how to do that. They were brought up in a way and in a culture that forced them to know that, what I think maybe isn't the thing, right? And so to the extent that the design community and broadly the maker community can include those people, right, I think will be of tremendous value for all of humanity. So that's my little comment that I really wanted to make. And then the second thing I'll say is something that Andy and I have talked about before, which is, practicing. So much of the design world, just looking at it from the outside, if we're talking about UX design, right? That's not something I do, but just looking at designers as a community and makers as a community in digital spaces, there's just no time for practice. Everybody's a frickin' order taker, right? It's just like, do this, do this, do this, do this. And so this idea that you get to go out, fiddle with something, make mistakes, see what would happen. We've talked about it before in previous podcasts. Almost any other artistic, sports, other types of teams, they practice for the event, right? They probably spend way, way more time in practice than they do actually doing the thing, right? And when we're recording this now, they just started the Olympics, and the internet's full of Simone Biles doing amazing things as a gymnast. And she's put in some hours, right? So that she can get that few minutes right. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about practice. Like, do designers practice? Do people who are making these places actually get enough practice in, and what that might look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do want to circle back to the point about greater inclusion, especially of people who have been traditionally misrepresented or underrepresented. I definitely agree with you, Lisa, and I think that one of the things that gives me hope about our current time is the fact that we have so much more awareness of that issue. And I see so many people working to correct for that imbalance. I even put brackets around the word master for this very reason, right? Like even our language is permeated by these structures that we traditionally haven't paused to question, right? So yeah, it's a tricky challenge, but I do see it as a very positive sign that there is greater awareness of the issue, and especially that people are very consciously working to ameliorate the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just tack on to that. I know you're moving on to the next one, but I just want to say, just in hearing you feed that back, I'm very centered around being a Black woman because that's my experience. And, as Andy knows, I'm on my way to moving to the Netherlands. And one of the most humble experiences for me is that I don't speak the language, right? And so, I had to sign a lease. I had to figure out a Dutch lease. And I had this all of a sudden visceral experience of what it's like to be a really intelligent person who is used to having a lot of agency, all of a sudden have to not be able to do the basics. And it made me really think about, people that come to this country, doctors and lawyers who are driving around in cabs. And so I just wanted to say that to even broaden that comment even more. There's a certain humility that's forced on you in that type of situation as well. And so when you talk about inclusion, I think it's important to be richly and deeply inclusive, right?
I wholeheartedly agree. I am an immigrant myself.
Yeah.
And I came to this country speaking the language, so I did have that advantage. But as an immigrant, you face all sorts of challenges that nobody else even thinks about, right? So yeah, I believe that we thrive in diversity and in bringing as many viewpoints as possible together to work on moving things forward. And anyways, we have so much more work to do in that regard, and that could almost take up an entire hour, that conversation. But I do want to move on to your question about practice, because I think it's very important. There's a couple of angles there. One angle has to do with the degree to which we are happy with our jobs and excited to do the type of work that we do. All right. And I'm going there first because I recently ran a poll on Twitter, which I know is not in any way a scientific survey, right? It's almost like a self-selected sample. It's like people who are on Twitter maybe are not happy with their jobs or whatever. But the question I asked was how, and I'm going to have to paraphrase, but the gist of it was, how do you feel about the concept of having a job? In other words, not how do you feel about having a job, but how do you feel about the idea that you have a job, right? And there were 4 choices, going from I love it to I like it, then I tolerate it, and I hate it, all right? And something like 75% of respondents said that they either tolerated it or hated it, right? And that to me, let's just say that it made me sad because we spend so much of our lives at work, right? That if you are merely tolerating what you do, I don't think that you're going to be motivated to put in the type of practice that is required, because practice, as I understand it, is not just about the time you devote to something. It's also about the quality you bring to that time, the quality of your engagement with the activity. Whether you are willing, for example, to go beyond the ask to investigate the foundations of what you're being asked to do. If all you're doing, like let's say that you're a very junior person in a team, and what you're being asked to do is to manage the part of the design system where, I don't know, buttons are documented or what have you, right? You can approach that as something that you must check off on a to-do list and do it competently. Or you can take it as an opportunity to learn about how buttons work, right? And I don't want to sound, I just said it and it sounded preachy to me. It's like, I don't want to tell anyone what to do. I just want to illustrate the fact that we bring different levels of engagement to our practice, all right? So that's one thing I'll say about that. The other thing I will say is that we have a problem in designing for digital environments, in that the craft aspect of our work changes very fast. If you were someone, let's say in the 18th or 19th century, who was apprenticing to become a master carpenter, right? Someone who could make a beautiful piece of furniture, you would be working with tools and practices that had been honed for a long time, for many years, right? And you had, I think that you could have a certain degree of confidence that the people that you would be mentoring would also be using similar tools and practices. I think that that is not the case for the sort of things that designers working in digital environments are facing. Our tool set changes very fast. I'm old enough to now have experienced several tool set transitions, and there are things that I brought from previous tools that help me understand the new ones, right? Like if you were doing this type of work in the 90s, as I was, you probably at some point used a tool called Macromedia Director, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
And Director had this conceptual model that had you dealing with certain objects and things. And the things that I learned in Director helped me learn a tool called Fireworks. And Fireworks helped me learn Sketch. Yeah. And Sketch helped me learn Figma, right? So it's not like there's a radical break in that type of tool set, but they are different. And it's possible to become really adept at one of them and have that knowledge kind of go away when something better comes out. But I'm also thinking of tools like... consider the impact that artificial intelligence could have on our work. A lot of the very granular, like let's call it screen level design work that we do today, I think can be fairly competently replaced with systems that are good at analyzing patterns of what works and then recreating those patterns in a user interface. I think that that's coming, right? And that to me suggests that the practice that we should be thinking of when we think about practice is at a higher level. It's not the same practice that someone who learns to play the piano does, right? It's like we're not going to get familiar with the piano, with playing the piano. We need to get familiar with composition and reading music and understanding what makes music work. That's the level at which we need to be thinking of. And what that translates to in design is what I've been advocating for the past few years, which is working at the conceptual level. It's like rather than working at the UI level, spending more time honing our skills at thinking about conceptual relationships between parts of the environment and the objects in the system.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you a little bit only because you're talking to a piano player. So that's a great analogy. It spun off a lot of things in my head. And so I don't disagree with you. And I think it's an and there's a value in both. You're going to be a better conceptual person. You're going to be a better composer if you're composing for the piano, if you play it, right? And the better piano player you are, the more likely. I'm not saying that you can't do decent composition for the piano, not playing it, but I just can't put away the fact that if you've got fingers on keys, even if it's something like, let's talk about tools, understanding the way your fingers work on keys and what your hands can and cannot do easily from a transition perspective, right? That's what I see a lot of people who don't really have a rich understanding of the systems and technology that they're designing for, writing impossible to play piano pieces, basically doing the equivalent of that, something where you need three hands, right? And so I would just wanted to stick that in and say, I think it's an and, right? And it's not necessarily, and Andy and I did a, designers learning to code deep dive or whatever. So I'm not talking about that, but I'm kind of in that area of kind of like the more you know, the better type of creator that you can be. And we started off this podcast with you talking about all the things you do, or I don't know if we had hit record on it before we were saying you do so many different types of things. And I'm completely convinced that richness, all of that richness allows you to do your main job better because it means you're more engaged in the world in a lot of different ways. So I just had to interrupt you and say that.
Yeah. No, I love it. And I don't disagree with you. I don't think that, to be clear, I don't think that AI is ever going to replace all of UI level design, right? In much the same way that, let's call it canned music has, it hasn't fully replaced virtuoso playing or people who are doing beautiful work in the piano, and I'm going to here tie it back to the carpentry thing that we talked about earlier. It is still possible for you to buy beautifully handcrafted furniture, but the vast majority, I would guess, the vast majority of furniture that people buy today is not made by craftspeople, right? You were talking earlier about I'm going to bring it back to the beginning of the show, the regulations around strapping furniture to the walls in California. I'm in the process of strapping some IKEA bookshelves today in my home, right? And those were not produced by a master craftsperson. They were clearly made by a machine, right? And you need to understand, in order to design something like that, I would expect that you need to understand the properties of those materials, but you also need to understand the properties of the machinery that are going to produce those things,
Correct.
Right? And that's what I mean here, that we need to think as designers at a higher level. It's like, I just wanted to make that point because I think when a lot of people think of practice, they think, well, I need to roll up my sleeves and fire up Figma or whatever, right? And yeah, it's important for you to do that. It's important for you to know that level. But I think that designers who want to be positioned for long careers in this environment need to be practicing also at a level above that. That's the
That
yeah.
Yeah, Jorge, that makes total sense to me. The thing that I think about, though, I've seen these user interfaces that are built by AI, and I've seen some of the capabilities of what they can do, but I do agree that that level of thinking just needs to be there. Now, some of that thinking, and this is the question that if I didn't ask, people would be like, why didn't you talk about information architecture in much detail? So when we talk about a high level of thinking, but we also balance that with speed, and we talked about speed earlier, but when it comes to speed in creating products, it seems like some steps are skipped. Sometimes it's like, we know enough. Do we need to do more research? Or, for example, the one you're closest to, information architecture. I often see the information architects are struggling to get involved in a product. They're almost having to spin up their own like epics or big things that they can go after and tackle. So as you co-author, the most recent editions of the book on information architecture, what shifts are you seeing? Are you seeing that like IA's kind of this discipline that's almost becoming forgotten or swallowed by UX? Or are you seeing pockets of IA that are really truly able to solve big problems and deep information and drive those relationships of how information is translated to the product roadmaps? And just like, what are you seeing as you work on, different iterations of this book and the evolution of the discipline of information architecture?
I think that information architecture is less well known today than it was, say, 20 years ago within the field of design. And I also think it's more important than it's ever been. I would like to believe that that it is on an upswing, and I'm just saying that because I do see more posts being written about information architecture, more chatter in the social networks about information architecture. And few things would make me happier than for people to start acknowledging this more. I will also say that I think that there is a fundamental tension at play here. And it's not a new tension, but I think it's becoming, it's coming to a head now. And the best way to talk about it is, I think, is as a tension between top down and bottom up. Right. And you talked about speed, Andy. It's not just speed per se. It's kind of speed in the right direction. And, if you're going, it's possible to go nowhere fast is what I mean. Right.
Right.
And the question is, or the wrong place. Exactly. Right. Like even worse than nowhere. It's like you end up in a bad place. Right. So the question is, how do we go as quickly as possible in the right direction? And there are, I think that there are there's a fundamental tension there in that there's an implication that there's some kind of agreement on what the right direction is, right? But but that must be counterbalanced with the fact that you have to have some humility. You do not know everything needed to get there from the get-go, right? So you can think of top-down as knowing where we're going, right? And you can think of bottom-up as being able to sense your environment to make the adjustments necessary to keep us on target. Or perhaps to determine that, oh my gosh, there's a cliff here, let's go some other way, right? You need a balance between the two. And I think that part of the bad rap that information architecture has gotten in the past is that there seems to be this awareness or this understanding that information architecture is all about top-down directions. And it might be that a lot of people conceive of it like that, but my understanding of information architecture is actually heavily informed by Lisa's work in governance. And whenever I teach information architecture, that's always where I end. I end with governance, because it's not just about setting a top-down direction. It's also about setting up a system that will allow the structural construct that you're proposing to remain relevant, functional, valuable in the long term. And we can't have the arrogance to think that the thing that we're designing now is going to be useful 5-10 years from now, especially not in this field that is changing so fast, right? So we have to do a better job of again, humility, right? Like thinking we're doing the best we can with what we know now, and that includes setting up the systems that are going to keep this thing fresh and relevant and valuable. And that's where I see governance coming in, right? In that that entails creating structures, which is what information architecture does, designing structures, but it's designing structures at the level of it's like we're designing the thing that designs the thing as opposed to just working on the thing, right?
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you. Anyhow, I think we might be at time. Which is shocking because there's just so much more richness in this conversation, which means at some point you'll have to come back again. Or selfishly, I see a meal with either a couple bottles of wine or a beverage of anybody's choice that the three of us could have at some event where we are and enjoy this conversation some more.
That would be lovely. And now it's seeming more and more feasible. Right?
Yeah, at least for those of us in places where there's a vaccine, and I know the pandemic is just still raging in huge parts of the world right now. But I'm very, very grateful to be fully vaccinated and able to get out and about in the world again. So yeah, it's a real privilege, and it's been a privilege talking with both of you. Oh, thank you.
Awesome. So Jorge, before we let you go, how can people get in touch with you or find out more? Obviously, you keep a journal and you blog quite often. So how do people stay in contact with you?
The best place to contact me or find out more about me is on my website, which is at jarango.com. So jarango.com.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy surfacing, please rate, review, and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/surfacingpodcast. If you have suggestions for guests or a topic you'd like to hear about on surfacing, please reach out via the contact form found at surfacingpodcast.com.